Okay, so hello everybody, good afternoon, early evening. We are very fortunate to have two, not one, but two professors of anthropology with us today. From the University of Southampton, Department of Languages, Cultures and Linguistics. University of Southampton, we have Marion Demossier, who is a cultural and social anthropologist, and who runs a module called Fragmented France, which is at the intersection of the questions around racialization and the debates around belonging in France. And this is where her work chimes with the work of Paul Silverstein, who is here with us from Reed College, which is a liberal arts college in the US, Portland. Is that right? Yeah. And Paul is an anthropologist, a professor of anthropology, who has written extensively about or situated in postcolonial France. He's written a book, in fact, called Postcolonial France. Prior to that, a book on Transpolitics of Algeria in France, 2004. And they are going to converse in the frame of the public life lecture series. So it's going to be a conversation, and Marion will introduce her questions through, I think, the prism of this notion of fragmented France. And Paul will respond, and then they'll bounce ideas off each other. So thanks everybody for attending.
Thanks, Sam, for a very good introduction. And I'm delighted to meet Paul because I've known his work for many years, especially your book in 2004. And it has been, it's on the reading list of the module. I've been teaching on Fragmented France. And being myself exiled from France, because very often in some the French commentators are describing the French who are leaving. They have, they've decided they've opted for the exile. And it is a specific category of actually naming people who are leaving what they see as the best country in the world. So I'm going to start maybe with a question which is very dear to my work as an ethnographer or as a social anthropologist. And something I came upon when I was looking at your presentation on the website with all your publications is what does ethnography mean from your point of view, especially because also you've used ethnography in a kind of transnational context, mobility being part of it, and also quite a lot of your work was done in a community for a number of years, several decades. So can you expand a little bit on how you do ethnography?
Well, thank you, Marion. Thank you, Sammy, for the kind of introduction. It's really nice to be here in conversation with you and to share our ideas, and both about fragmented France, but also about maybe indeed, how does it mean to do a kind of ethnography? What does it mean as a social anthropologist to be looking at kind of living issues that are issues that are social problems? And I think one of the challenges I had when I was starting my research, especially because I was thinking about working in an urban area with mobile communities, immigrant communities, in a kind of space that I was defining as a transnational space, people and ideas and politics that should move between Algeria and France, between, that where those distinctions started being kind of, in some sense, not erased, but kind of clouded, was to develop and to think about how to do a kind of ethnographic project when the community you were working with was not so clearly spatialized in, the cardinal, in the imagined case in anthropology of a kind of delimited village, or a small island. And this is the kind of cases that were always kind of where you imagine ethnography happens, where you imagine anthropology happens. And one of the challenges was to kind of retain that which I think is special about ethnography as a method, which is to develop a kind of an engaged and embodied, an intimate set of longitudinal relationships with a set of interlocutors, where the questions that you're asking are emergent, where the kind of what you're learning is emergent from those long-term interactions that are based on maintaining kind of and creating levels of trust that are about and relationality, about kind of about learning how people live not just as a kind of theoretical kind of mode of of thinking and knowing, but as a kind of embodied way where one lives with and alongside and kind of and learns to internalize the logics of that which happens. How do you do that in a space where you're not necessarily sitting in the village the whole time? And it was a challenge because indeed, like I had to kind of re-identify some of those things. If I wasn't working in a single neighborhood or building, how could I define like a network space of interactions among people who were activists in associations, who were intimately connected through their politics as a site and as a space that I could myself kind of somehow contribute to through my own kind of ways of engagement and knowing, and kind of learn to ask the questions that were meaningful for them, to learn to listen. Often we think of ethnography as about learning to listen, and that it took a while. I went in with a set of questions, and I learned how to ask the right questions by people, with people who were very engaged in these kinds of, in the social problems, in this case, of what it meant to be North African, Muslim, from a minority Amazigh background, indigenous kind of peoples in North Africa, in a space that in a secular republic, in a racialized republic, in a place like France that had a very strong idea of what it meant to be French. How did I learn how they were navigating those problems, those issues, those demands, and to ask the right questions that were meaningful for them? I thought I started off with a set of questions that were purely based on, I think, a set of presupposed notions of what identity is. And I thought identity was, well, learning how to be a second generation immigrant and balance your culture this and culture that, and learning to integrate and assimilate and all that. And what they told me was, very early on was, no, that's not the problem we have. I mean, that is a problem. But the problem we have right now is that there's a civil war going on in Algeria. We're tied to people whose lives are being lost. We're tied to, our families are there and suffering. We're trying to get our, relatives here. Our communities there are being put into question. We cannot pretend to just be French because we're also this thing in Algeria is happening. So I learned to reframe the kind of questions I was asking around them. That's what ethnography allows for. It's emergent. It's,
Yes, I think it's very interesting as well. I think it's probably contingent to the political context in which you were conducting the ethnography itself. Let's say the example of, remember the Sarkozy era, being, intense securitization, complete recreation of the political sphere around specific groups being, the target, and explaining all the social desire and problems with those groups. So I wonder to what extent the context also is shaping, their sense of identification or sense of being completely marginalized, and how they respond to it or not. And I think some of the examples you've given in your research is very much about how they try to recreate a new form of identity to negotiate those kinds of pressures on who they are as a group. So can you expand a bit on that, especially from the Sarkozy era, moving out of that? And
Absolutely. And it also it also allows me to then trace the work as I move from France to Morocco, which is where, I kind of follow these questions too. But yes, a lot of, as I came to develop the project, the original ethnographic project, I became focused more and more on folks who we would now call part of the Amazigh community, but the term that was used at the time was Berber. These are people who were from the region of Kabylia in eastern Algeria, who spoke a language that was not Arabic, who came from an area and came from a country where their language was suppressed, where to speak and to express themselves and to write in their language was to risk their lives, was to risk imprisonment, was to risk deaths from the states, which happened over a period in 1980 and 81 and 88, 89, and then was happening again in the midst of the Civil War, which was being used as where there had been an Islamist insurgency that had been an excuse for the government to kind of double down on its military presence and crack down on all dissent within Algeria, including in the Amazigh areas, in the Berber-speaking areas of the East. This was a context, and that was, and Sarkozy, in the period of the 90s, was using this similarly as an excuse to kind of, to augment what was essentially a police state, and to kind of surveil and discipline people of Arab, Algerian, North African, Muslim backgrounds into a particular way of being French, and to kind of, in a sense, kind of create those divides and double down those divides to deport people to jail, jail. And this was in part because of the ways in which the violence from Algeria was spilling over to France, but it was more, again, a pretext for a larger thing. Within that, this Amazigh community had to find a space to, people who were and I was working mainly with activists, but not just with activists, with the fellow travelers. So there's a younger generation of Amazigh, people of Amazigh background who were born in France, for who we're rediscovering, in some ways, we're kind of, in a sense, becoming interested in the particular Amazigh kind of side of their background. And we're having the courage to speak it. For the first time, really, in France, and in a sense, pulling their parents, for whom they had been kind of keeping their heads down from doing any politics whatsoever, because they had come as either immigrant workers in the 60s and 50s, 60s, 70s, or had come as part of a kind of family where, kind of felt precarious in France. The younger generation was not afraid to speak. They were citizens. They had they had gone through a different kind of education, political as well as social, cultural, etc. And they were willing to speak, and they brought people on. And their argument was something to the extent of, we are French, and as French, we're speaking in this way. We are Algerian, and as Algerians, we're speaking this way. They were willing to speak both sides of it on behalf of Amazigh, on the Amazigh community. And one of the ways they're speaking was, do not put us all, you Sarkozy, you, the French state, are putting us all into the same box. And the box you're putting us into is this box of like the dangerous Muslim. And you have to understand that what you're actually talking about is a very diverse community. And some of us are actually deeply secular. But we're truly secular because it's part of our culture. It's not because we're just kowtowing to, the demands of the Republican state. We were secular before you were secular. We were like, and a kind of way of positioning themselves within France they have a political speaking position that varied. Now, as I trace this community forward, as I trace these activist movements forward, I should say, more than community, though, again, they're networked in ways that kind of, they recognize each other. As I moved to Morocco, that, the people I was working with, even a small village in Morocco, were deeply connected through various kinds of national and international organizations, transnational conversations with some of the people I was working with in France, and some of them had done reciprocal visits in both directions. And as we move into the contemporary period, the post-Sarkozy period, this kind of language of secularism is no longer quite as important. The laïcité it's shown to be a dead end. Because at the end of the day, if you're playing the game of laïcité, you're playing the game of the French state. And I think what now the language people are using when they're speaking about being Amazigh, and this is a language they're using now both to the Moroccan state, to the Algerian state, but also to the French state, is a language of indigeneity, a language of being of an identity that is tied to kind of a notion of a kind of decolonial movement that is transnational and global and articulated through the Americas and all that. And it's one that speaks to also kind of UN working groups, and it speaks to it can put them into a different kind of conversation. That is a powerful conversation because it's also now suddenly about territory and about control over territory, not just about religious practice. And to assert a kind of belonging, a kind of we are here, which is happening in very strongly to a set of territories of which people have intimate relationships with, literally as kind of lands in places like Morocco and Algeria and beyond, but also in some ways to the areas they inhabit in diaspora. A certain kind of indigenous, their own kind of different kind of, we belong here in France too, because we're from here and we're through generations deep. That's this kind of shift of language that I think has become powerful. Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. And you think it's more the younger generations which have pushed that shift and are transforming the sort of language of everyday life in France and repositioning themselves as a kind of having a specific culture and being at ease with the sort of framing of their sense of identity in that context.
Right, but yes, I mean, but it's also a younger generation, and again, I'm talking about crowds of activists who are internationally networked. It's people who are also, are from somewhere but live beyond it, and so it's also folks who are deeply have not only deep connections to families and comrades in North Africa, but also are now educated in a far more, if you will, cosmopolitan. But I mean cosmopolitan, I don't mean just like, a localized cosmopolitan. I mean like literally people with international experience and who read internationally and who now have English and now have like whatever, and they're able to kind of state. And some of these folks, end up leaving France. I think we were talking about before when, before the conversation started about thousands and thousands of people of these kinds of backgrounds who no longer, who are certainly French by, then carry French papers and perfectly, have control and competence and command over French language and culture, but who now find themselves, I think about themselves as kind of cosmopolitan citizens who are building new lives, whether in places like the UK, or in Canada, in the United States, North America, or in Dubai, in the Gulf in general, where the kind of privilege of their passports gives them a status that and a recognition that they struggle to have in still, in the racialized society which France is. North Africa doesn't exist as the same category in the UK or the US as it does in France. They're French, right? And then the same kind of happens in Dubai, the Gulf as well. So I think the younger generation has those capacities because of education, because of language competence, because of professional training. These are often people in the middle class that their parents did not have because they were already, they came in without the same language competence. They came in without the same kind of privilege of bureaucratic paperwork. They could not do politics in the same way because they were always living these precarious lives. They were deportable in ways that the younger generation is not.
And you think as a result of that kind of cosmopolitanism and also, globalization to some extent, political activism has changed, or the nature of what they do as a way of exacerbating their kind of growing visibility is there. Because it's quite interesting in terms of the concept of the transnational cultural heritage, which is developing. The UNESCO is very keen to look at it.
Yeah.
And reading your work, I was thinking, well, that's interesting how this diaspora can actually, they have developed arts and the politics of arts as part of that kind of way of asserting themselves in the world. Do you see it as part of that kind of new narrative of who they are?
Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, it's a globalization from below as much as, to a certain extent, it's about UN working groups and about a kind of official languages and official programs that people can kind of tap into, because that comes with funding and that comes with status and that comes with recognition. But on the other hand, there's that kind of globalization from below, you might say, which is the kind of informal ways in which language and ideas and categories move that create new resources for political mobilization. And this could be even languages that were previously unacceptable within kind of public discourse in places like France that are being forced into the conversation. The language of colonialism, postcoloniality, decoloniality, which is now a powerful indigeneity. These are powerful languages that weren't part of the conversation. In fact, we're marginalized from it. We're seen as like external imports. The now younger generation, including those in the French Academy, who are often in dialogue with colleagues abroad who have done part of their education abroad, who work through translation of texts. These have come through into the kind of French public discourse, and now they're serving them, they're imposing them. You can do a kind of, as there's a Black Lives Matter in France, there's a Black Lives Matter movement in France as well, as there is in the US, there's in France, as there is, or you might call Muslim Lives Matter, Arab Lives Matter, Palestinian Lives Matter. These things move. And whether or not, and they may still threaten like some folks who try to hold on to a very conservative notion of what the kind of national polity is and should be. But nonetheless, they're unavoidable. The power of just the demography has shifted what it can be. And that's a kind of example of a kind of, kind of informal kind of global movement of ideas. You want to call it globalization, we can come up with other words for it, but like it's one that I've seen in the course of since I first started doing research in France under Sarkozy, in the Sarkozy years of the 90s. Actually, it was before that, and during I started during the Chirac years, from the 90s to 30 years later, it's been a big shift. It's been a big shift of which almost, which is just exciting to me in some ways, both as a scholar, but also as just a person who's engaged in the world and sees the vibrancy of what's happening in a place like France. So I'm more comfortable at some level in France now than I was before. That doesn't mean that aren't still kind of the levels of race, racism and inequality and Islamophobia that we had before. And sometimes they're augmented, sometimes they're, and the rise of the far right. But, that's, the United States is, arguably worse, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes, and I think it's quite interesting in terms of the shifts, because I keep thinking republicanism is still alive, it's still there, rhetorically, and it's still there in some of the policy decisions that have been made under Macron more recently. And I think it is true that the younger generation is starting to push and to open the kind of gate of post-colonial cultures and debate. Yeah. But what I've seen as well, because I remember the article, the book written by Stéphane Beau and Gérard Noirel about race dans les sciences sociales, I think it was 2020. There was an article in Le Monde discussing this book. And actually there was a huge amount of scholars who were really pushing back and saying, but that's an American model. I mean, we're talking about it a bit earlier. That has nothing to do with France. We don't think about race. Race doesn't exist. So I wonder if I can ask you to maybe unpack a little bit, because I, as a French person by citizenship, not by sense of belonging, because I've always fight that kind of, if I am asked, oh, are you French? I say, no, I'm not French, I'm a human being. At the end of the day, I think it's really important to try to think, why is there a kind of difficulty in dialoguing about the translation of can race be translated from one context to another? Why the French feel offended by the fact that we try to use the concept and use it productively in terms of rethinking their so-called liberté, égalité, fraternité, which doesn't exist. So, and it's where I think of anthropology as something original to say about. What do you think of that? Yeah. As an American scholar, probably read a lot in France as well.
Yes, and this is a great question. It's a difficult question, right? Because we're between categories, when you use categories like race or racialization, that are simultaneously emic and edic categories. They're categories from below and they're categories from above. There's analytical categories, but there are also categories of everyday speech and how people talk. As anthropologists, we're always moving between these two. We're trying to develop our edic categories from the emic categories. We're trying to then use those as a kind of new insight into comparative work that we're doing. We're never just studying, a particular culture, we're studying the human, right? Anthropology, it's the study of humans, not the study of like a particular, we're not doing, I'm not doing Frenchology, I'm not doing, Algerianology, I'm trying to kind of get at something bigger. So this is it, but it's in this kind of slippage between the edic and the emic that some of these questions arise. And so in the case of France, there's, I think, two things going on simultaneously. There's one, and that we're trying to call attention to when we say, look, when we're trying to kind of insert a kind of analysis that also includes kind of race and racialization and racism into the story. One, which is to call into question the myth of France as a raceless society, which is betrayed by its own kind of racialized discourse and racial discourse explicitly about race that gives us the very genealogy of race and racism back to Gobineau and beyond, and back to the colonial period, which was a racialized, which was a world that was like literally where race was a category by which peoples were categorized, classified, put into hierarchical positions and the like. This is part of the French tradition, and it's one that it's deeply part of the French tradition, but it's one which the Republican state tries to kind of counter by trying to draw a genealogy that goes straight back to like, kind of a particular branch of the revolutionary spirit through to a kind of jumps forward to 1905 laïcité and like, goes from there, like, a kind of evocations of like, we're all like transparently part of this public world and like our thick attachments are left by the wayside of religion and race and ethnicity, et cetera, et cetera. So one, it's to like, for me, it's to kind of re-engage that genealogy of that very kind of entity and that kind of political, the political category of France, and to call it and to point out its own kind of kind of racial background that also has this kind of racial analysis or racial kind of ideology built into it, and to call it and to point at that, to say like you may tell yourself a story you're all about class, but but you're actually mistreating your own history and your own like ideology. The second piece of it is to kind of on the emic side is to say like you may be is to say that these are important categories because they're the ones people are using on the street. If when there's and they're using them on the street and they may be developing them in as they look to North America or as they look to the UK, but that doesn't make them any less real for people as live categories of identity and belonging. So when people in certain northern suburbs, in the northern suburbs of Paris, living in housing projects, talk about their housing projects as a ghetto, and they use the word ghetto. You might say, "Oh, that's not a ghetto," because it doesn't look like the ghetto of the south side of Chicago where I lived, or yeah, right. I mean, or wherever. It's not monoethnic, it's multi-ethnic. It's not like, it's not, ravaged in the same way by deindustrialization, though it is, ravaged by deindustrialization, but it's not as bad. And that may be true, analytically speaking. Louis Facon wrote an entire book saying, like, you can't use this language and you have to make these distinctions. And like, of course, as sociologists and historical scholars, we would want to show those differences. But I, as an anthropologist, also have to take, and we as ethnographers have to take seriously the language people use to describe their lives. And if they're looking to North America, they're looking to elsewhere and finding in those descriptions, whether they're from popular culture, from the language of hip hop, or from the like long struggle of civil rights in the United States and the UK, and they're seeing that as a kind of motivation, inspiration for their own thing. There's a reason for that, right? It's not random. They're seeing it becomes good for them to think, and it becomes part of that, like then the ways in which they see themselves. We look elsewhere to understand ourselves. This is to be human. And so I think it's also important to take that seriously. So when I see these debates, I think it's a kind of aspirational hope of certain scholars to kind of, by somehow speaking it, kind of call forth this kind of like imagined, idealized kind of France that like somehow sidesteps the kind of like part of its own history and kind of imagines,
Yes, no, completely. I think it's a good point. I think quite a lot of the ethnographic research done by this new generation of scholars who are engaging with post-colonial cultures and with the legacy of the empire as well, and what has been going on, is opening new doors. But I'm not saying it's an easy task for them, because I think very often they are against, group of academics and scholars who are extremely rooted. Yeah. And the power structure is still not necessarily the easiest way of getting out of that. And I think it's interesting in terms of, I was wondering about the regional dimension. We haven't talked a lot about it, because what I'm seeing when I'm going back and doing field work, even if I'm working on one communities, which is quite traditional to some extent, I've seen a reconfiguration of the regional kind of dynamic of identity building, where on one hand, because there has been devolution, more money going to the regions and less Paris being there against, if it's Marseille, against Marseille, or against the kind of ways in which politics was done. I wonder if you picked up anything like that, where the regional, c'est-à-dire an extended version of the local, is also transforming and nuancing a sense of belonging there across the case studies you've been looking at.
No, so it's a good question, an interesting one. I mean, I was interested before in the ways in which the ways in which the articulation of certain kinds of subnational identities, whether they were happening in Brittany or in the south, in Occitania and Catalan, Basque areas, and all this. So there's a kind of sense of like a multiplicity that exists within the hexagon. This just within the hexagon. Now, if we move to the département d'outre-mer, now we go into like an even deeper complexity of like what makes France France, something that from the Parisian point of view is like more or less ignored or marginalized and all that. But I was interested in the kind of articulation of that kind of sense of the multiplicity of France as a kind of, and the dialogue that was happening at various moments, certainly when I was doing research in the 90s, with other kinds of minoritized identity formations that emerged from post-colonial immigrant communities. So particularly the ways in which the Amazigh activists I was working with kind of looked to what was happening in Brittany, in the Basque Country, in Catalonia, and all this as which were pushes for regional languages, recognition of regional languages and cultures, and a certain kind of if not exactly autonomy, but a kind of sense of like a decentralization. That these were productive ways that they could learn, and then they could think about how that might play out in Algeria or Morocco. And indeed, the emergence of a transnational Amazigh movement starts at a film festival in Brittany, where the film festival in Brittany was featuring films from various different minoritized communities around the world, including from the Amazigh region. And it was at that moment was the first time that people came across that activists from Moroccan and Algerian and Tunisian and Libyan backgrounds first came together and really recognized and started putting the first steps in place for a transnational Amazigh movement, for a World Amazigh Congress that would later play out and then come together and then divide and do all the things that social movements do. So there's that side of it. And then there's the second side of it, which is something that I'm still trying to understand. People, and it's an emergent phenomenon where you have the kind of regions which push back against the center in the Gilets jaunes movement, for instance, which is a complex array of different kinds of positions, right? Some which are go from the far left to the far right, some which like engage like different kinds of groups, but all of which I think are come forward in a kind of pushback against a certain kind of centralized elitism that happens within Paris that seems to leave off a sense of the sharing of resources across the vast things across the country. And there's a version of that happens in North Africa, has been happening in North Africa as well, with the various movements, whether during the 2011-2012 uprisings in a place like Morocco, the February 20th movement, which called for decentralization, which called for semi-autonomy, if not self-determination of some of the regions, or what later kind of emerged as the Hirak movements, both in the Rif Mountains, but also in Algeria, which also similarly pushed back against the centralization of the state and wanted more kind of regional control. So there's all these ways in which these kind of complex configurations of the local, the transnational, the regional, the kind of pan-regionalism come into play. That it would be.
And that's quite difficult to capture from the point of view of the anthropologists because it is also constantly changing and never negotiated. And
live on the ground in the protests themselves, sometimes.
Yes, and I think Marseille is an interesting example in itself as well. And I was thinking about what has happened with the famous round of the museums that Layid has talked about, where they send a number of kind of traditional emblematic sites, museographic sites from Paris, the Musée des Arts et Traditions Populaires, got transformed into Quai Branly and then Museum. And how, for example, culture, because it goes back, it's in parallel with some of the reflections you had about how culture is used as a kind of a political tool to reshape some sense of of who people are, where they belong, and their sense of future as well, which is quite important. I think it's quite interesting because it's happening, I think, quite strongly in the UK as well, where the arts are called for a number of kinds of ways of supporting industries which are struggling and giving them a more kind of legitimacy in the landscape. I'm very fascinated because the reading your work, culture is there very much at the kids. It's poetry, it's music, and quite a lot of my Kabyle friends from when I was a student in Paris, they were actually becoming cosmopolitan by studying new Indian music and going there, being funded by the French state, going there, learning to play harp or other kind of musical instruments. So I remember that being really interesting in terms of navigating and instrumentalizing culture as a way of getting out of those narratives of you are who you are. And so can you expand it? Because I know your work is a lot on the arts as well.
Yeah, well, I'm very interested in the emergence of certain kinds of musical traditions, and as well as certain kinds of literary traditions now. And I've started to kind of think about I started the project many years ago, thinking about a moment in the 1980s with the emergence of what was called Beur, or second generation North African literature, now semi-autobiographical novels that were being written, more fictionalized accounts, poetry, musical forms that were métis, that were purposely hybrid, that were trying to bring together different forms of North African and French styles in a way that was deeply local, like to particular kind of neighborhoods, right? So there's this kind of, and that was an effort to kind of carve out a space within something that was, where it seemed to be little space at the time. You were either French or you're not French. You're either you either hit the norm, which was a very white norm. I mean, very harder to say it otherwise, or you were North African, you're Algerian, whatever. And this was an attempt to do that. So now I find myself, whereas that was not the centerpiece of the project, as I started kind of later working on the kind of more political activism, I've come back to recognize just how important music making is, musicking together, right? Whether it's people, connecting through their sharing of certain forms of being able to kind of hum the same tune or kind of bring in different kinds of musical experience into something that they can create live on the ground, to the ways in which some of those, the emergence of Kabyle, Amazigh political folk song from the 1960s fours, and the ways that continues to be dynamic and inspire, the ways that certain music makers like Layid back in the day in the late 60s and early 70s, as he was emerging, or other intellectuals from that period who were imagining worlds differently, met together at the Pan-African cultural festival in Algiers in 1969, and really kind of learned from each other. And there were Panthers who were having these poetry sessions, and there were these artists like Layid and Ben Mohammed, his collaborator, who were learning and kind of bringing together kind of North American folk music with Kabyle traditions. I've been translating recently the memoirs of Abraham Safarti, who is a Moroccan Jewish activist, militant, anti-Zionist, pro-Palestinian, important person, in history. And he had helped co-found an arts and literature and political magazine called Souffle, or Anfas, or Breaths. And the first thing that they did was it happened to be right in the late 60s, and they went to the Pan-African Festival, as a cultural festival as well, in Algiers, and he writes about it. And he's there in Nadir, and it's if there's one moment in time you want to go back to see the emergence, and there's Angolan, Marion, who's there, and all of these, and René de Best from Haiti, who was part of the Negro Tune movement. And it's these kind of moments where people are coming together and recognizing their anti-colonial and decolonial projects that are also literary projects and film projects and musical projects. If I could go back in some place, I would love to go back there.
Yeah, just to jump onto that, because you have a related question in the chat from Joe Turley, who is a professor of fashion and textiles. The question is, have you seen articulations of multiplicities of identity through clothing or dressing? And if so, whether this changes across region, familial or friendship groups? Is this a device to demonstrate individuality or fitting in or standing out?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very big question, of course, and there's a lot of pieces. I often say that part of the performance of identity, I've somehow read this is like about dress and address. How you perform yourself in a thing is how you present yourself, how you dress, and how you address, how you use language, and how you perform verbally, but also how you literally present yourself somatically, and and corporeally through clothing, through fashion. These are, I mean, if I going back to some of the earlier research in the 90s, one of the things that struck out to me was how much was consolidated in a particular form of fashion that was very regional to a particular kind of what was sometimes called the suburbs or the banlieue, the housing projects of the north of Paris, but also around Lyon and sometimes in the south too, which was which involved kind of a mixture of athletic wear with kind of which is pretty kind of what do you call them? Sports suits. Is that the word? Tracksuits. There we go. Tracksuits. Sorry. I'm clearly outside my on the edge of my my knowledge of the industry. Tracksuits, baseball caps, and the like. That were associated with a particular kind of form of masculinity. I'm thinking about male dress. That were also tied to an emergent kind of moment within the transnational spread of hip hop and particularly rap music as it was being picked up in these areas outside of sometimes partly outside of in Marseille, in the Quartier Nord, but partly also outside there in the suburbs of Paris by a few foundational groups who had kind of learned them through traveling hip hop shows that had come from the US. And there's a kind of way in which that fashion was picked up, and it became like very kind of prevalent, at least among these young men, as a kind of mode of performance. It was also easily kind of like recognizable to the police. And it became a form of racial typing, such that as much as what the color of your skin or the accents of your speech, it was how you dressed that identified you as from the police point of view, as somebody from, say, a particular area. And there's a kind of postcode racism that was happening at the time. You might call it that a particular form of policing of folks who were saying from these kind of working class suburbs, from these kind of neighborhoods, from the housing projects, as they would come into Paris, they would get stopped and they would get hassled and they would be told to go back to their areas. And that was done on the basis of dress. So if you want to avoid that, as I discovered, by just kind of looking and talking to people, if you wanted to avoid that kind of hyper policing, that kind of form of police racism and stops, you would dress in a different way. You would dress in styles that connoted your professionalism. You would avoid that particular dress that would connote your. So that's a small example of it. There's other examples of it that you can say in terms of kind of crowds of more kind of self-aware activists who kind of often take on somewhat symbolic forms. I mean, I have, whether they're a shesh, a kind of a particular form of, something you might wear on your head, or a form of, or a keffiyeh that they might wrap around their neck as a form of a political solidarity, but also a gesture too, sometimes to where, they're from in North Africa or a particular that gets incorporated into whatever they're wearing. These are small pieces of a fashion kind of statement. I was interested also at the time in kind of how people would decorate their apartments and what they would put into them, what kind of pieces they would use to signal a certain kind of belonging, a certain kind of identification. Maybe they're a tea set, or maybe they're like a piece of engraved wood. In extreme cases, it would be among people of Kabyle Amazigh background, that they would kind of recreate some of the features of a prototypical house in Kabylia that had been well documented. though they may have never seen directly themselves, but they were kind of had seen pictures of, that they would reproduce some of those features literally in their Parisian housing project apartments. That would gesture to it. So these are small symbolic ways of kind of asserting a kind of belonging that moved across space, but was tied to space at the same time. I don't know if that was a long-winded way of answering these questions, but.
Can I pick up the sort of the police state? Because I know you've written as well about the kind of violence, endemic violence, which is characterizing the French state. I mean, something you cannot ignore when you arrive there in any station is how there are guns everywhere, and you feel that you might be in different parts of the world. And I wonder about that because I know this morning in America there were some protests and there was a strong criticism against Trump reaction in standing the armed force and there. And it's something I've always thought implicitly that, effectively more securitization leads to more violence, leads to more problems. What are your thoughts about that? And especially the Berber community and the Maghrebian community at large as well, they've been always, identifying those kinds of protests, and they've been always the target of the police. And now that the police force also has increased its capacity in terms of using very high performing guns, things which are really in other places forbidden to use. I wonder what you think of that sort of hyper securitization of the French state against what?
Against what?
Against what? That's a provocative question, but I always wonder against what.
Yeah. I sometimes think of these as spectacles, right? They're spectacles of state control in areas that, in moments where the state feels almost threatened by the belief that maybe it's not in control. And it has to perform both to itself and to its citizens a form of over the top, presence. Just, to head off that kind of fear of non-presence. So the version of it I often think about is in the again in these kind of northern housing projects of Paris, which again I spend a lot of time in, and which are incredibly mediatized. They're constantly being reported on. One of the things that kept getting reported on was somehow that there were no-go areas for the police. That the police wouldn't go there, that that they were too afraid. And these were lost territories of the republic. This was the discourse, right? But if you actually go there, they're not lost territories. The police are not absent. They're over present. It's the one way that you're going to, if you're a young person growing up in these areas, you will encounter the police. They will stop you. They will ask for your ID. They will they will hold you up. They were present at the train station. So president of the train stations with the ports of entry into Paris. They're this is it's not a non-presence. It's an over presence. And it's a little bit like who's the performance for? Partly it's telling people to know their place, stay in your place, keep your head down, cross the streets, be afraid of us. We're in control. You're not in control. You man, whatever. Partly it's performance for others to say look, we're telling, we're keeping, we're here to keep you safe from those people because they're dangerous. So it kind of points to dangerous based on a kind of, a racial or typing of some sort, or racialized typing of some sort based on, where somebody's from or how they approach, how they dress and address. Partly it's also but in any case, regardless, it doesn't actually, and my intuition is a little bit like yours, it doesn't actually make anybody feel safer. The goal is to make people feel more threatened. The goal is to make people feel more afraid. And it often calls forth kind of a reaction. And that reaction, we know, is going to be the television cameras are going to come. And the television cameras are going to come, and what the television cameras are going to show are people being violent against the state. which then reinforces the need for the state and the policing and security. So it becomes this like, self-perpetuating cycle. Now, when you interview people, when people, when you talk to people, when actual, I think ethnographers, like when I spoke, like, why do you react, to kids? Like, why, the police come, they're looking for a fight, you give them the fight. Why do you give them the fight? You're going to be filmed and it's going to work against you. They say like, well, how else are we going to call attention to the problems we have if the cameras don't come? How else are we going to call attention to the problems we have if like we don't do anything, if we just sit here and just take it, at some point, sometimes it's, being gullible, it's being like, it's just too much and we can't take it anymore and you have to do something sometimes. But sometimes I think it's a thoughtful notion that yes, there's a danger of negative representation, stereotypes, and reinforcing those, and then this kind of the cycle of more violence, more police lead to more violence, which leads to more police, which leads to more, et cetera, et cetera. But on the other hand, like if lives feel unbearable, at some point, how do you communicate? If you burn a car, people notice the car is burning, right? Even though, yes, okay, it's probably your neighbor's car and that kind of stuff, but hopefully they have insurance, and they get paid for it.
And I wonder what you think of the role of the anthropologist in drawing attention to those mechanisms. I'm thinking, I know that Didier Fassin had lots of, he was asked by Hollande to advise on policy, but all of that has gone since. And I wonder if, do you think the work you are doing, there is, it's now red, and then what is the impact of it, if any?
Yeah, well, it's hard to, judge the impact of, a particular thing one writes per se, especially an academic text, which, is mostly read in other academic texts. So it's, I'm grateful to people like yourself who will teach, the text, and maybe a younger generation of future citizens of the world, if you will read it and maybe learn something and kind of like, it makes the world seem a little bit more complex for them. And it opens up possibilities of other ways of being human. And that's the anthropological goal, of course. It's a kind of liberal fantasy of what we do. There's a kind of, within the field in general, and this is my piece of it is the same, there's a little bit of a tension between calling attention to suffering and to risk representing people as but suffering subjects. This is something that Joel Robbins, but many other anthropologists have written extensively about. And a lot of the field of anthropology right now tends to kind of want to, for all the great reasons, kind of show suffering, show like moments and call attention to moments of state violence, call attention to moments of marginalization and inequality, and to kind of, in a sense, kind of articulate that kind of experience. I think we also have another duty, which is also to kind of make sure we remember that people are more than just their sufferings, and to humanize, and to kind of also show moments of other forms of life and livelihood and joy and whatever, that the same people who are suffering because of police violence or state violence are also building meaningful and robust lives amongst themselves through the cultural innovations and how they dress and how they make music and how they do art and they're adding something to the world and innovating the French language. So those two things, as ethnographers, as writers of people's lives, we have to keep into account at the same time. And then to find venues and maybe collaborative projects where we can get that a little bit beyond the academic sphere. I tried to do a little bit of that to the work I've done with the Middle East Research and Information Project, which is a way of translating academic work about the world that is broadly the Middle East, North Africa, in a language and to a larger readership, open access online we've been working on since 1971. The project has been going on. It's an ongoing project and it's produced thousands and thousands of pages of but also of these reports, but also brought scholars and activists together from across a vast region in this kind of larger project. But also kind of some of the collaborative work that I find myself now doing, whether some of the translation work I've been doing or in terms of supporting younger scholars and activists in North Africa in their own kind of scholarly and activist projects, most recently through the emergence of I mentioned Abraham Safarti in his literary political journals. There's a younger generation of scholar activists in Morocco who've rebooted it as an online Souffle Monde, that's kind of more globally located, that involves scholars, Moroccan young scholars, activists who are based in North America, who are based in Europe, who are based in Morocco, and they brought it together along the same lines. And and the work I've been doing, helping them with some translation work, helping them kind of get the word out there and kind of supporting theirs, has felt like some of the best anthropological work I've ever done.
Okay, that's interesting. And I'm thinking more broadly as well, what do you think of ethnographic writing? Because, I think in terms of developing an impact, very often, as you say, people will not necessarily buy an anthropological book and let's read it and understand it entirely. And I keep thinking, well, maybe we need to even innovate. I mean, as you suggested, diversifying the different voices we can represent. But any other kinds of means, I'm thinking, for example, of comics. In France, they are using comics quite widely. I think Philippe Descola, the anthropologist, has contributed to one. And so I wonder, is it something you've been thinking about yourself in terms of how can I write about what I'm doing in a different way?
Yeah, so some of the writing I've been doing over the years for America has certainly been Middle East reports, but it's definitely been in a different voice. But the work I did translating a Moroccan novel and using kind of all my ethnographic background and linguistic and like cultural knowledge to kind of bring out those voices, which then is a novel that's accessible, that we republished in its French original, but also in English translation to get it out there. It was published in North America, which is fine because that's a publisher and we publish in French, but that allows people to read it, but it's also kind of expensive perhaps for a Moroccan reader to buy a book from North America. So finding a Moroccan publisher, I was suggested very strongly by a colleague to do it, instead of just republishing in French there, to actually create a bande dessinée, a graphic novel version of it. And this is a scholar whose work I really respect, a Moroccan anthropologist named Omar Boum, who just himself has come out with several different graphic novels, working with, in one case, an Algerian artist who'd been a political cartoonist, and they put out a novel about the Jewish experience of the Second World War, Undesirables, it's called, a wonderful thing in North Africa. And then more recently, a graphic presentation of his father's life with the illustrations done by his own daughter. But his father, who was the last generation of foot messengers across southern Morocco, that was done in kind of graphical form. So he's like, these are projects that I think are really interesting, that I try to support as much as I can, and that are inspiring me to think about different ways of doing ethnography.
Okay, I think that's a good way to finish. We can cut that was yeah, so thank you so much for the conversation. I think there's a lot there, and I think this will go up online, so there'll be a trace of this that you can send to colleagues, or we can circulate on the online space for SIAH, ANMT, and the various channels that are being represented here today. Yeah, it was a really good conversation. I thought that's good job. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.